Hello, social workers of Alabama. It's so good to be with you today with this episode of This Week in Supervision. This week in supervision, we talk about some of the cases and some of the things that we have talked about during the week in supervision, and we try to support you with ideas that might support you if you are doing supervision yourself. Or if you're just someone who's interested in learning about human behavior and some of the other things that we talk about. You may have seen the title already today because we're going to just get right into it. But we've got a really interesting title today. And the title Is Adoption a Big Deal? Is adoption a big deal? I don't know how many of you have worked in adoptions. I bring this information because some of the supervisees that I'm working with have worked in adoptions, are working in adoptions, but it's really important whether you are or not. You could be working with a client who has been adopted and you're not in an adoptions agency. And so how would you respond to working with this client? And there's certain things that we just need to know. I was just thinking about it because I used to do groups and working with adoptive children and groups with their parents. This is where I really started out clinically. And I remember how shocked I was, the things that you don't know unless you're in that situation, how shocked I was to find out how many adoptive children didn't even have a photo of, things early, a photo of them earlier in their childhood. Many times these things are missed. Because of the situations, just having a photo of you being young, a photo of you as a baby. It's so much that they are unable to trace many times. All adoptions are not the same, but not even being able to see what you looked like as a baby. And that happened often. Okay. But what we did, I like to challenge the group. And this is an example of what we might do, right? In a situation like this. So I'm going to challenge you. We're going to show a quick video. Okay, and this video is is with a number of children who have been adopted, and they're giving you a little bit of a take of what answering questions about what it has been like for them being adopted. Okay, and so I want you to kind of look at this, at the video, look at the children here, and I want you to pretend as if they were a client of yours or something like that. Now, which child, which situation stands out the most? Now, we're gonna not gonna process this child. We're gonna use this as a scenario, a likely scenario that you may encounter and be exposed to, and hopefully, I'll get the opportunity to talk about what happened with me when I did not understand the importance of I didn't understand the importance of well, it's just certain things that you need to know when you're involved with intervention, and when you don't, you go badly wrong. Okay, so we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I'm going to share my screen really quickly, and uh, I want you to evaluate which situation here would you be most that you would pay attention to most if you were the therapist. All right, let's see if we can get the screen shared. Here we go. All right.
What do you wish that your classmates knew about how it feels to be adopted? I wish they had a little more sympathy. Um, I wish it wouldn't be to be around people that aren't adopted. They used to ask, "Oh, your mom used to be Chinese, right?" Or like, they used to ask the race of my parents, and like, "Oh, like, why'd they give you up?" And yeah, it used to be hard. Yeah, I was put in foster care, and then I was adopted, and my life is not tragic, I guess. I think that it's kind of something you're never gonna completely like be like, this is what it means to be adopted. But I guess you just kind of figure it out like a little bit and you're like, yeah, that's cool. Still confused, but that's cool.
I haven't had really any negative things. It's just more people are surprised. Yeah. I'm adopted. So.
And when you tell them, no, I'm just adopted, like, does that feel like a empowering statement or like a put down or just neutral?
It feels like a good statement. I tell my mom sometimes that I feel like I have a second chance because of all the opportunities her and my dad gave me in my very fortunate life, and so I'm able to try new things and go new places that I feel like I wouldn't be able to go without them.
For me, it was never a big deal. I was like, yeah, okay, I'm adopted. And everyone was like, what? Really? And I was like, yeah,
Why do you think they're surprised and excited at first?
because it's like a exciting experience. I don't really know. I wouldn't know because I'm just like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
But I guess they think it's like exciting and new and like interesting.
Is adoption a big deal? And we're going to step away from Isabella and we're going to pretend as if we had a client who tells us that adoption is not a big deal. What's the fuss? Well, everybody's all, excited and or just, thrown apart about the adoption. But for me, it's not a big deal. So why are you all making it a big deal? And you know what? That may be the reality for some of the clients that you work with. Um, that may be the reality. You may have an adult client, and I remember having an adult client who pretty much expressed the same thing. This was one of the worst cases that I treated because I was early in my career and didn't have all of what I needed to understand how to work through these situations. It's really important to know that just because a client tells you that something is not a big deal, as a professional, it's your obligation to make sure that is so. Okay? Because many times as humans, we're in survival. So we're not always 100% conscious of what really lies beneath. And as a survival mechanism, we skip past things. On last week, we talked about how with both people who are people pleasers and both people who have narcissistic traits and those that are in between, that when you haven't had great attachment with a loved one or family member, and you can't understand why it is in that situation that I'm not having my needs met. I'm in a traumatic with a situation that's traumatic for me and have been in a number of situations that feel traumatic for me, and you don't seem to care. When we don't understand why that occurs, many times to support the ideas, the ideations that come to our minds as a response when we're grounded in that moment and in those and then in another moment like that, in another moment like that, and feeling the thoughts as a child, a young child, that it doesn't seem like you really care about me. It doesn't seem like my safety matters to you. It doesn't seem like I'm valued. At some point, we often click into fantasy to cover up what we actually feel. And think about it, if we're going to cover up what we actually feel as a child, because most children at a young age aren't able to process that, hey, my parents have a lot of problems, and because of their problems and because of their childhood experiences, this is the reason why they don't understand how to attach to me. And so, therefore, I'm just going to make my life great and not pay attention to that. Yeah, a child is not mature enough to skip to that level. And so often we attach and start to believe that there's something with us that is causing them to respond to us this way. And even if we don't think that way, we develop defenses, okay, to protect ourselves from being emotionally torn apart because of these circumstances. And this is what happens. Now, back to our situation here. If you have a client that says, you know what, let me hurry up. Boy, if you have a client and they say, adoption didn't bother me, it was no big deal. Okay. This many times as a clinician, I am going to need to, and you need to too, you're going to need to identify if this is so or not, especially if it is a young child, because most of the time they haven't had the opportunity to sort these things out. But even if it's an adult like what I worked with back in the day, you still need to process with them. And it's going to be left on your clinical judgment and your clinical questioning if you're able to find the answer for that. Okay? So a response, something simple as, and we'll get to this, that um and with the child especially, you want to avoid making things too ultra serious. Want to keep it kind of light. And so I might, if they said it's not that big of a deal, I might say something like this with an expression like that. Tell me more about why that's not a big deal for you. And then just silence. Tell me more about why that isn't a big deal, why adoption is not a big deal for you. And you want to be curious to understand. These are questions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, that help to try to help us to understand if this concern has truly been resolved. Sometimes maybe they have worked it out. But for us, in many situations, us being therapists, adoption is a big deal, isn't it? Okay. But we want to be guided by what the client has to say. So we discussed about, from an attachment standpoint, let's look at a few things here, right? So I want you to think about it. If you were to look at things from an attachment standpoint, and we talk about who was responsible for the primary development, who is attached, what theory is attached to attachment theory. We talked about Bowlby, and most kind of know that by now. But let's talk about Bowlby in this situation. Okay, John Bowlby. Bowlby. I can't ever say his name right. I'm sorry. Um, so from a attachment perspective, what might be going on here? Okay, and I'm gonna share a little visual here so we can look at this here. Okay, so when we're looking at it from attachment perspective, this type of response, we may determine that, you know what, it seems as though the client is somewhat minimizing the impact of the situation. Are they really grounded into the situation? Some clients may dissociate sometimes, and we can't just jump to judgment, but many times this is an indication that the child is in a sense been separated to some way emotionally, generally to protect themselves from the meat. Again, they may have switched into fantasy, but whether they became somewhat detached from the situation or whether they developed some type of fantasy about the situation, basically, fantasy is unrealistic ideation or ideas about what really happened. Like I said, for me, when I was young, dad wasn't around. I developed the fantasy he's not around because he's in med school. I never traced him ever being in med school. And by 17, that kind of dawned on me. He couldn't have been in med school for 17 years. He ain't like he's not here, bro. Okay. And so sit in that. And the incident happened when that occurred, with all that realization coming to me, and I was broken down into tears, and I was pissed. I was upset that I had to experience that emotion. And that was not the beginning, but it didn't support the ability to somewhat separate from things, to not be dependent. So this might, in this situation here, this might, with someone saying, "Hey, it's not a big deal," they may be taking somewhat of an avoidant, a dismissive, avoidant approach if we were looking at it from the standpoint of attachment. Okay, they're minimizing emotional needs, that the client may have learned to minimize emotional needs and dissociate from loss and rejection, especially in early attachment disruptions that may have occurred. So, many times when you've learned to do that, you also do that in relationships when you become older. Okay, let's move forward. We got to move forward. All right. What about from a psychoanalytic standpoint? If you were to think about what could potentially be happening here from a psychoanalytic standpoint, of course, that's Freud, what might be occurring? Okay, so let's look into that. All right, we're going to skip on to psychoanalytic here. Saying it's not a big deal could be a defense against pain and abandonment. A defense. We're trying to protect against pain and development. From Freud's perspective, this is unconscious. Okay. There may be identity confusion. We're trying to protect against pain of abandonment, identity confusion, and questions about self-worth that often surface in adolescence. This is something that I strongly identified with adoptive children when I was working with them. And and when I was working with the families, and I say this over and over again, there would be a small percentage of very functional families, in my opinion, functional families from the aspect of how things were working with them and their children. And some were functional still, but we had some barriers that were sometimes harming the children because I would talk to them a lot of times, right? And what we would see is that many times the children um, they weren't having opportunities to talk about their birth parents in detail. Like, what do you think about this situation? What do you think they would be doing now? Or just rendering to the questions that go on in their mind that have not been resolved about their parent, the anxiety, the questions about, is this person looks like they could be in my family? Like the mind, what I would learn from many adoptive children, that they would be thinking about their parents on a daily basis or relatives. But then often the parents weren't talking to them about this. Why? Think about it. Why? Because there was a humanistic fear. A lot of the parents were still alive. They did, would you, if you adopted a child, and you put your all into that child, would you not possibly have concerns about their affections dominating yours? Okay, their affections to their biological. Would you not? So maybe you would never have the fear that if we allowed for the opportunity for them to meet their biological parent, that they might just want to go with them. Or is there a fear like nobody doesn't want an addict to repair, but might there possibly be a fear that all of a sudden they get their life together and this child has been with me for 10 years, and then okay, they want to pick up their child. Yeah, yeah, I want that to happen, but that hurts. The reality is that hurts, and really the reality is that I want you to rehab and to have your child, and I want to have your child too, or my child. Now this is my child. Okay, the reality is, of course, that's the fantasy, it can't happen, but the reality is that they're human. If you have adopted a child, you're human. And so this is the fear that I would see. And it would sometimes get in the way of helping that anxiety driven child. All of them weren't that way, with relieving some of those things, with just talking about that family member. Sometimes these family members, and I was in counseling when this happened, these family members were demonized because some of them had done some horrific things, but it was never helping the child to demonize it. Okay. So what happens is this child has to deal with this pain many times by themselves, and many times they're afraid to speak about it, even to therapists, because they want to be grateful and a number of other things. Anyway, I better move on. All right. All right. So saying it's not a big deal could be a defense against that. That's from the Freudian perspective. And then from Erickson, if we went to more of the psychodynamic, psychosocial, there might be questions, right? We've got these questions. So we got the 15-year-old, and at this stage, you might ask and question your group, like, what stage is this child in at 15 years old? Identity versus role confusion, right? I think it's 12 to 18, you know, something like that, right? um, and so questions that might be asked: Who am I really? Where do I come from? Why was I placed for adoption? Okay, and so these are some of the things that kind of lie beneath. Some of the things that end up being a significant concern that we want to look into, and this is what we talked about, is suppressed feelings. Okay. Um, Deep abandonment wounds lie with some of the clients. And I had this particular client, like I said, the individual said that there was nothing wrong, it was not a big deal. I gave them an activity, and I can't get into the details, but let me tell you, the activity was to get them to basically be looking into some of the things that they might would have talked about if they were able to talk with their adoptive parent. Um, Questions about, not in this directly like this, but why did you give me up for adoption? You know, things like that that should never, in my opinion, be given to a client, even if they look like just like the young lady here, even if they it seems as though this has been resolved. Okay. And this was a horrific situation because the response from the client once they went through this activity at home, the outburst, the the trauma that was experienced in that home as a result of this faulty move. I hope that you would never do that in practice. I was young and didn't know any better. More so, what I would recommend is that if you're going to do an activity, which it needs to be done, something like that, I wouldn't hand it out for homework. Or if I did, don't do this until hours before the session so that raw emotion can be processed in the session. But for safety, I just wouldn't do it at all. We could talk about this in the office at the beginning of the session because it may take the whole session to pull them down. But there's stages before we even get to this. This is not something we're doing right away. But deep abandonment wounds. So thoughts of you left me. I wasn't worth keeping. These are intense feelings of sadness that can be developed, fear, emotional emptiness. We've got to rule that out that this might not be a part of what's going on. Like with the example we had earlier, that may not be happening, and we don't want to. We just kind of want to just create an example here. But if you were to have a client, you got to find out, is there something that lies beneath, because it's going to be showing up and it may be the primary reason why they're in your office. Okay. um so when some of these things are brought up, you may have someone who hasn't been actively showing a certain level of anger, or you hadn't known that they were capable of it, and then all of a sudden this comes out. Buried shame, something else to be ruled out, something else that many adopted children have to deal with. There must have been something wrong with me. I experienced a situation with a another adoptive client, and we were processing some of the things that I was like, that deep stuff about, like, okay, questions about why I was giving up. The reason we talk about this, I choose to talk about it because with many children, it's something that is on their mind all the time, whether it's been buried to the unconscious or not. And there's certain questions that you've got to ask to see if that's the case. That's the skill, something we teach, right? To identify if this is the case or not. But with this particular child, it was the case. And when I talked about, like, the question about, has this have you thought about um why you were, adopted, why your birth parents decided to, um, you know, place you in adoption. The response was um, that, something like this, that maybe it's because of I believe it was because of the tremors that I have, and things like that. Like if I got a nervous tremor, okay, maybe it was because of the nervous tremor that I have. And the question I had to ask the child, I said, and because I was at that point, I was a little confused myself. I was like, am I not correct? But were you not adopted at birth? And then we just sat there and thought about that. And so here again, so in other words, that couldn't have been the reason. But what we have to process in therapy is that there's this protection, you all. The fantasy, fantasy doesn't mean it's something good. It's just something better than what I want to think about myself. It's something better. It's not a good feeling to think that I was given up. Of course, we don't word it like that, but that's what a lot of times the client is thinking. So the fantasy is that, oh, this is why. Because that hides the pain of me believing that there was something wrong with me, as we can see here, shame. And so you see shame in a lot of what they do. You see insecurity in a lot of what they do. You see them trying to do more in relationships than maybe what's necessary because deep down inside, a lot of times that thing has not been resolved. There's something wrong with me. And so going on through life, you can see the processing, and this is what we identify in therapy about the belief that there's something wrong with me. And then we have repressed anger. Okay, and we don't have time to get into all of these, but this is what we talked about. So some of the things I want to end on is what's some of the clarifying questions that we can use to gently probe deeper to find out what's really lying beneath. Okay, one question might be, what does uh, not a big deal mean to you in this situation? Because they're saying it's not a big deal. Another one, when you say that, do you mean you've never really thought about it or that you've decided it doesn't affect you or it doesn't matter to you? How did you come to feel that way about it? These are all different ones. Have you ever been curious about why your parents made the decision for you to be adopted? Uh, to be adopted. I'm kind of messed that one up. Do you think other people in similar situations might feel differently? Why do you think that is? So this is a really good one because many times you're not going to get the information from the client, okay? Because they have repressed it, they have detached in a sense, and they may have become, you know, detached, avoidant, um, and so they're not going to because it's too hurtful to think about what this means to them and they're not going to process that well. But what I have learned, a technique that works well, sometimes they won't, a client, whether it's adult, young child, whatever, they may not be able to, don't have the capacity or choose not to talk about their hurt feelings. But you many times can get an interpretation of what they really believe about that by asking about someone else. Do you think other people in similar situations might feel differently? Okay. Um, and so when we're talking about somebody else, that's taking it off of me. Some of the things that I would do sometimes if you want to know how they feel, if this was a friend or if this was your brother, because he was your brother was adopted too, how do you think that they feel about this? Sometimes they don't know. Or how might somebody else feel about this? Now I'm separating from myself, and many times the answer that you get is really based on them because that's the only context, especially with the child, many times the only context that they have. So these are different things that can be used. And you see some of these other examples here in the chat. We're going to stop right here because I went way over more than what I anticipated. I do want to share with you that we will be having a continuing education CU training coming up soon. And we want to invite you out to that and we're excited to have this on January 20th at 5:30 p.m., where our speaker will be Angela Webster. And we're speaking on raising a nonprofit, building systems that care as much as we do. And if you're a member of Social Workers of Alabama, you know we have a special for you. But we want to invite you all to come out here for this continuing education. And then of course, we have the social work supervisor training, and we've got a lot of supervisors coming out and doing their thing. We had an awesome training on last month. We want to invite you on March 23rd to join us. This is an online training, and you will get what you need, the tools that you need to get started. And then lastly, we have the online course. This is the DSM course for those of us who are looking, clinical social workers, and we're looking for those clinical CEUs that are required. We have DSM CEUs that are required by the Alabama board. Check out DSM 5TR Disrupted, Understanding What Others Miss. And we want you to join us. But we are at the end of today's presentation. We went way over, but maybe if you didn't watch the whole thing, you catch some clips. If you did watch it, then you already watched it by now, right? So thank you for sticking around. And we will see you all again on next week. Y'all take care now. Bye bye.